Golden Age conjures up a time, usually in the past, when all the planets kind of seem to align and some pinnacle of human achievement was obtained. It also conjures up a very special sense of place where it all happened. And finally, it conjures not just major achievement, but also major influence, and an influence that extends beyond the time and place of its origin. So by this standard, most countries have never had a golden age. A fortunate few have had one golden age, and I can't name any country that's had two, but I can name one that's had three. And that, of course, is Italy. And Italy is unique in this regard. So the first two golden ages of Italy will be familiar to you. So 2,000 years ago, Rome created an empire that dominated the Western world for an unprecedented 4 centuries. It was a triumph of military conquest for sure, and at best, the Roman Empire was a model of governance, one that offered relative stability and security for individuals in a brutal and tribalistic world. Rome held together its very diverse territories by both creating the infrastructure and operating system, the hardware and software of a unified society. So Roman engineering genius gave us bridges and paved roads and aqueducts to connect both the people to life-giving resources. And importantly, the Romans built cities, creating a sense of local community and broader inclusion, and some of the longest lasting buildings from antiquity. And of course, there's Roman law, which was really the empire's operating system. And it was based on core principles of the promise of citizenship, property rights, and equal protections under the law. And all of this would unite the largest citizenry the world had ever seen. And Roman law would, of course, prove very influential in the formation of our own republic many centuries later. So then we have Italy's second golden age, which was the Renaissance, that 250-year creative flowering and intellectual transformation that began in 15th century Florence. The Renaissance spawned not only timeless artistic treasures and scientific advances, but moreover the very appreciation of human agency that so informs our modern sense of ourselves, effectively passing or sharing the baton from God the creator to man as the creator or co-creator. So now I'm going to introduce Italy's third golden age with a quiz. So you know USA Today, they do like best colleges, best hospitals. They do a survey, best countries. So best countries survey in 2022. Okay, they surveyed 85 different countries on 73 different attributes, and it was ranked by over 17,000 adults from around the world. So what country do you think received number 1 for has an influential culture? So, ta-da! And then these are what followed. And then fashionable. Yay.
Shocker.
And then interesting, there's France, Spain, and we're there, UK. And then how about has great food? Right? Okay, so
You're giving away prizes,
this is
Carla.
look at this. This is so interesting to me. So you have Spain, and you have Greece. I mean, this is really interesting. And then what happened to France, right? It really kind of fell from grace, and it's tied with Thailand. And you know, in Thailand, I mean, I love Thai food. Okay. How about sexy? Yeah. Can you compete with that, right? So, and then of course we're number 2 there. So that's pretty good. So the thing is if this survey had been conducted, say, 70 years ago, the answer as to has an influential culture, that might have been the same, but it certainly wouldn't have been true for the other questions. So what I want to do now is take a look at this unprecedented third golden age, which I call the golden age of beauty and pleasure, and examine how did it come to pass, and just what does it tell us about Italy. So Italy had been brought to its knees by World War II with massive destruction, abject poverty, and ignominious defeat. But from the ashes of near annihilation, Italy would rise again like a phoenix to its third golden age, one that would wow and win over the world, and a very different world. So in less than 15 years after the war, Italy experienced an almost unimaginable image transformation, a miraculous makeover. In the early 40s, Italy had been an Axis power, an enemy of the free world. Yet by the late 1950s, Italy had in certain ways become the envy of the free world, a world dominated by those who had defeated Italy, and most especially by America. So how could this happen? Well, in a nutshell, or a metal canister, it began through the celluloid alchemy of the newly emerging international medium of film. So if Italy had one consistent face between the 2 world wars, unfortunately, it was this one. Mussolini was in power for more than 20 years, from 1922 up till his arrest in July of 1943. And in the immediate aftermath of World War II, scenes like this were distressingly common up and down the Italian peninsula. Yet, a mere 8 years after the last shells were fired, Hollywood stars could be seen on the American big screen, experiencing the joys of buzzing around the 7 hills of Rome on a Vespa, licking gelato on the Spanish steps, dancing in the moonlight beneath Castel San Angelo. And a mere 7 years after that, in 1960, this iconic movie would come to symbolize the new Italy and the new Italian spirit, one that would enchant and captivate the world for years to come. So how exactly did the face of Italy morph from that of Il Duce to La Dolce Vita in just 15 years? Well, it happened, as I said, through the medium of film, but not just any kind of film. So Italy's miraculous makeover began with the Italian invention of a totally new form of filmmaking, what became known as neorealism. So Roberto Rossellini was the pioneer in neorealist cinema, and he sold his bed to help finance Rome Open City, the 1945 breakout cinema sensation. Neorealism provided an unadulterated window into the harsh realities of World War II Italy. Filmmakers hired ordinary, untrained people in secondary roles to capture that sense of realism. They didn't use sets. They didn't have any. They had to, make do. But instead, they used real settings with real people in the background to further the effect. And themes focused on the reality of the times, poverty, classes of living under an authoritarian regime, and the effects of war on a post-war society. Rome Open City depicted scenes of the Italian resistance during the Nazi occupation just years before in 1944. It was unstinting in its treatments of the horrors of war and featured scenes of torture, abuse, violence, and a shocking execution in the final scene. And the world of film took notice. Rossellini's Rome Open City received the grand prize at Cannes. And then other films like films like The Bicycle Thief by Vittorio De Sica, which was really about the ordinary struggles of Italians, to maintain a shred of hope or dignity in the face of brutal poverty and bureaucratic indifference. And these films struck an even deeper chord with audiences. And through these films and others, ordinary Italians will become seen less as wartime perpetrators of evil and more as victims of horrible circumstances and as real people who were always credible, often resilient, and occasionally heroic. So first they won our sympathy and after our admiration. And in a way, this was a necessary precondition for what would follow. And just a few years later, when Italy and Italians would come to represent a new way of living and a source of aspiration. So by the early 50s, the miracolo economico had begun, and Italy was well back on its way to being, on its feet economically. And neorealism wasn't the only show in town. So this is really interesting. Something that was part of the Marshall Plan. So Italians, they've always really loved the movies. They love going to the movies. And Americans were very keen on getting American films back on the screens in Italy. And a provision of the Marshall Plan was that the money and profits that Americans would make from presenting their films in Italy would be put back into making films in Italy. And so it was reinvested in films that were produced in Italy. So Roman Holiday in 1953 was one of the first films produced as a result of the Marshall Plan. And then films like Three Coins in the Fountain, Roman Adventure, Light in the Piazza, even Gidget Goes to Rome were produced as part of this whole Marshall Plan thing. And these were really the movies that most shaped Americans' perceptions of Italy as the ultimate romantic setting, right? And so it was so successful was this image makeover of war-ravaged Italy that Federico Fellini's movie La Dolce Vita became synonymous with its Sabiritic sounding title. Now, I don't know if you've seen this movie, but it's like largely nihilistic, and Marcello Mastroianni's really handsome, but he's a spiritually bereft protagonist. But the fact of the matter is, many more people had seen Roman Holiday or Three Coins in a Fountain than had ever sat through 3 hours of La Dolce Vita. But practically everyone alive has seen the image of Anita Ekberg and Marcello Mastroianni kissing in the Trevi Fountain. And as they say, the right picture is worth 1,000 tourist brochures. And in the process, the very expression La Dolce Vita became the greatest advertising slogan for any nation in history. So I just want to say a few things about Federico Fellini and his contribution to Italian film and ultimately his influence on world cinema. His career arc was stunning. He arrived in Rome in 1939 at the age of 19. He was born in Rimini, and he worked first as a cartoonist, a journalist, a writer of radio comedy, and then movie script writing and on-set apprenticeship with Rossellini. And he worked on the screenplay of that film. But it was really when he began to write and direct his own films in the 1950s that he really turned things inside out, or rather outside in. So in neorealism, you really have this dictum of character determined by historical circumstances. But with Fellini turning things outside in, he has character steered by, for better or for worse, his or her own subjectivity. And it's this very subjectivity that led to these dreamlike fantasies and surrealistic and often absurd scenes that made Fellini not only a legend, but also an adjective. So if you look up Fellini-esque in the dictionary, you'll find it, And there's really something like quintessentially Italian in Fellini's, life as circus assortment of films, their subject matter, their soundtracks, and their style. And Fellini's enduring influence can be seen in such diverse works as Stanley Kubrick, George Lucas, Woody Allen, David Lynch, Tim Burton, Wes Anderson. And it's really no surprise that the land of La Dolce Vita has fashioned more Best Foreign Film winners at the Academy Awards than any other. And in the last 3 decades, the most memorable Best Foreign Films were mostly from Italy. The Great Beauty, Mediterraneo, Cinema Paradiso, and Roberto Benigni's much-loved masterpiece, Life is Beautiful. So the humanity, the fantasy, and the visual style of modern Italian cinema would prove to be just the opening salvo in Italy's third golden age. So now I want to look at fashion and design. So Italy today is the country that we now most closely associate with style and fashion. And that would have been the automatic answer as well during the Renaissance, when Florence and Venice were renowned for their fine fabrics, their skill of production, and their flair and beauty of styling. Now, these were the clothes worn by Isabella d'Este, who was kind of like the Jackie O of the Renaissance. Other Italian royals and tastemakers featured in the paintings by Titian, Rubens, Raphael, and other artists. Now, Italy would never lose its reputation for the quality of its fabrics and its craftsmanship, but as the Renaissance receded and power shifted across Europe, taste began to change. And France would become the leader and indeed synonymous with the world of fashion. So Italians were seen as the makers of clothing and the producers of fabric, while the French came to be seen as the designers of clothing and the ultimate arbiters of fashion and ultimately taste. And this would be the prevailing view from the Enlightenment through the first half of the 20th century. Italy continued to hold its own in certain accessories like hats, leather goods, handbags, and shoes, but fashion was fundamentally a French thing, and no one could come close. Now that widespread perception began to change in the 1950s, largely due to the determination and ingenuity of two particular Florentines. The first was Giovanni Battista Giorgini, and he would light the fuse of Italy's fashion renaissance through his vision, his taste, and his promotional genius. He was born in 1898 to a patrician family whose wealth declined post-World War I. And he began his career as a traveling salesman with an Italian ceramic firm. But Giorgini was special. He had this nose for quality and this instinct for style. And he was a true believer and an advocate for Italian craftsmanship. And he pretty early on went out on his own and expanded his lines and clientele to include American department stores and specialty shops. And through his extensive travels within Italy, he became more and more convinced of the quality and the creativity of craftswork of Italian clothing. And he felt it was unsurpassed. And then the seed of an idea was planted in his mind that perhaps there was an American market for Italian clothing, one that would fit with American tastes and lifestyles. Then in 1950, after failing to persuade B. Altman, does anyone remember this word? To showcase Italian couture, his Italian apparel idea began to more fully take shape. So he decided to stage his own Italian fashion event in Florence in his family home, the Villa Torreggiani. But to pull it off, he had to convince several renowned Italian designers in Rome and Milan to participate, as well as a few emerging ones too. And at the very same time, he had to convince American buyers to attend his event, on the heels of the big fashion show in Paris. So, overcoming suspicions and doubts on both sides, he made it happen in 1951, a seminal event that would put Italy back on the fashion map. Now, among the participating designers were the Fontanas, three enterprising sisters of modest circumstances, but rich in the best dressmaking tradition. Their finely crafted and highly styled individualistic apparel had already gained favor, not just with wealthy Romans, but with a growing list of visiting American actresses. Myrna Loy, Barbara Stanwyck, Ava Gardner, Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor, Rita Hayworth. And also were participating was the designer and Duchess Simonetta Colonna di Cesaro, simply known as Simonetta. Simonetta's outfits were as fashionable as anything out of Paris. They had their own style. They were fresh, they were feminine, modern, original, and somehow truly Italian. And they were just simply gorgeous. So 7 other Italian couture designers exhibited their apparel in Giorgini's Villa's library. And the couture show was a major success. Every designer, Italian designer who came and participated came away with sales or a contract. And in a marvelous piece of stagecraft, and to accommodate more designers and a larger audience of international buyers, Giorgini held the next year's show in the Sala Bianca, the white ballroom of Florence's Pitti Palace, the former residence of the Medici family, and one of the most romantic settings in a city filled with romantic settings. And if you go to the Pitti Palace, you can see the Sala Bianca. It's just amazing, and it's kind of funny. Like I feel like Italy should make more hay about the Sala Bianca. There's just a little tiny plaque there. You know, you kind of need like magnifying glass to even see what it's saying about it. But anyway, this would become the new venue for Italy's big fashion show, a show that became known simply as the Sala Bianca. But back to Giorgini's original 1951 exhibit in his villa. Now, while Italian couture was an unqualified success, it was another one of Giorgini's inspiration that made the event an even greater instant sensation. So Giorgini knew that Italy had a kind of ace in the hole. Italy was far ahead of Paris in daily clothing categories like knitwear, sportswear, and lower cost designer lines. You know, what today we know as ready-to-wear fashion. Giorgini had also cleverly secured the presence of 4 of those designers, which he lumped together in something he called boutique fashion. And in a truly inspired gambit, he featured their clothing on the first day of the fashion show. And the event on American buyers was like palate cleansing after Paris, which only deigned to exhibit couture. And the design landscape would never be the same. Now, one of those 4 designers is our second heroic Florentine, someone who also happened to have a family palazzo of his own. And this was the 12th Marchese di Barcento, also known as Emilio Pucci. And Emilio Pucci once joked that he was the first member of his family to work in 1,000 years. And he worked as well as played, and both to great effect. He was a true Renaissance man, not only in pedigree, but also in output. Now, on the play side, he was a great sportsman: tennis, fencing, swimming, car racing, and skiing. He was a big skier. He was on Italy's 1932 Olympic ski team. But he was also equally accomplished in a wide range of academic disciplines, studying at the University of Milan, and then he transferred in 1935 to the University of Georgia to study methods of textile production. Then, as the fates would have it, sanctions were placed on Italy for Mussolini's aggression in North Africa, and Italian nationals in America like Pucci, found themselves cut off financially. But the Marcheses still managed to get to the slopes. In fact, to Mount Hood in Oregon, where he just happened to meet the president of Reed College. And actually, Steve Jobs went to Reed College. Anyway, he struck a deal. In exchange for graduate school tuition, room and board, Pucci agreed to coach the college's ski team. And he also designed their ski wear and their uniforms. And with Portland, the Portland outdoor clothier White Stag, that was my first parka. They created the first recognizable modern ski wear. It was form-fitting, and this commercially changed how people would dress for winter sports. Then, Pucci did the same thing for summer with resort wear, designing shorts and tops, swimwear in playful cuts and bright colors, and this would lead to even a bigger line of apparel, including scarves and blouses and dresses, created first for his friend and department store magnate Stanley Marcus. Mm-hmm. And Pucci was the first to create collections around the theme. So this was the Sicilian theme. I love this. And then here's a collection inspired by Sienna's Palio. And Pucci told the New York Times, and I'm quoting here, after the war, there was a great hunger for color, novelty, and playfulness. And Pucci's eye candy creations would remain as vital and influential into the psychedelic 60s and well beyond. And his vision of leisure wear was completely in sync with the increasingly casual tenor of the times. And his work always exudes useful energy and continues to even today. Now, while often emulated, Pucci's designs would always remain recognizably his own. And not just because of his unrivaled eye, but because Pucci was the very first designer to sign his garments on the outside. Now, before I move on from the 1950s, we need to recognize one more fashion shockwave coming out of Italy. So, if fashion had mostly been a French thing, it had also mostly been a female thing. So Paris had all but ceded men's fashion to Savile Row in London. Now they were, of course, purveyors of fine suits to be sure, but boxy, suits, rigid lines, a limited palette of materials and colors and details. Suits that were meant to be like inconspicuous. So into the breach stepped Italian designers, most notably the House of Brioni, which in 1952 presented the first ever runway show for men's clothing. And the suits were fluid and tapered, the suits that Marcello Mastroianni could be seen wearing on the big screen. So now, not only was Paris, but London was also served notice. Less than 10 years after the war, their days as the uncontested leaders in women's and men's fashion were numbered. And by the late 1970s, the great fashion rivalry was less between France and Italy and more among the cities in Italy, Rome, Florence, and Milan. And in that rivalry, Milan's star was on the rise. And it had less to do with couture and more to do with ready-to-wear trends coming out of Milan. Now, one of the main players in this shift was this man, Giorgio Armani, whose relaxed yet elegant menswear collection in 1974 picked up right where Brioni had left off. But it was Armani's women's collection the following year in 1975 that set heads turning. Recognizing that more and more women were joining the workforce, Armani's collection struck a resonant chord. His creations seemed to accomplish the impossible. They were both feminist and feminine. And like all Italian apparel, they were designed not only with style, but also practicality and comfort in mind. They were meant to be worn. And it was really Armani who was the first to understand that women needed clothes for work and men needed clothes for play. So we then have Armani's early contemporary, Gianni Versace. I like to think of Versace as an intoxicated Dionysus to Armani's refined Apollo. And the pair really represent this great example of the extraordinary bandwidth of Italians in all creative pursuits. Now, while Armani's designs exuded modern classicism, Versace's featured a riot of colors and patterns, and Versace famously declared, "I do not believe in good taste." So it was said of the two that Armani dresses the wife, Versace dresses the mistress. So these legendary designers and their many successors, with their fluid forms and capacious creativity, all seem to make it look easy. Oops. Sorry. And this uniquely Italian term, I think many of you are familiar with it, sprezzatura, sometimes translates to effortless mastery. And when it comes to fashion, Italy has shown the world that it can do it all. Women's, men's, work, play, formal, casual, refined, flamboyant, and to do it all with originality and genuine style. But what else would you expect from a country that coined the expression la bella figura? So just as Italy's great artistic legacy transcends painting, Italy's great design legacy transcends apparel. Italians care not only how they clothe themselves, but also how they surround themselves. So just as France had dominated fashion in recent centuries, so too had been the perceptual leader in home furnishings. From the time really of Louis XIV in the 17th century, and also Art Deco, Art Nouveau, up through the mid-20th century. However, today, Italy has become the clear leader in contemporary furniture design. And beyond furniture, Italians have long shown a knack for elegant problem solving known as aesthetic pragmatism. Just think of the beauty and utility of Roman arches. And this practical design genius was on full display in a wide range of functional objects, both for the home and office. And this is 1952, MoMA in New York City staged an exhibition called Olivetti Design in Industry. And more recently, Alessi has created some of the most iconic and practical gadgets for the kitchen and home. And most certainly, one of the greatest examples of modern Italian design engineering is the Vespa. And the Vespa embodies the freedom and spirit of La Dolce Vita. And it's a brilliant example of aesthetic pragmatism. Now, believe it or not, the Vespa was inspired by very inexpensive maneuverable military scooters that had been airdropped into northern Italy by the Allies in 1944. But only in Italy could a truly ugly military vehicle be transformed into a cultural icon. And of course, the sale of the Vespa stored when Gregory Peck took Audrey Hepburn for a spin in Roman Holiday. And this was probably the first notable product placement in a movie. Now, before leaving the road, I must acknowledge one more masterpiece in post-World War II design engineering, the incomparable and indomitable Ferrari. Former race car driver Enzo Ferrari's remarkable creations have won more Formula One Grand Prix than any other. And just as someone like Armani's very sleek fashion creations are designed to go from the runway to retail racks with minimal adjustments, Ferraris were designed to go from the speedway to the showroom with only minor tweaks. So non-racers could feel Ferrari power and red-hot sexiness. It's little wonder that Ferrari waited until 1984 to introduce a model called the Testarossa. So, our final frontier is food and wine. So, after the war, France was the leading tastemaker, not only in furniture and fashion, but also in the physical sense of taste itself. France reigned supreme in cuisine, but that too would change. Now I want you to consider 3 data points. So our first is, after studying at the famous Cordon Bleu in Paris in the 1950s, Julia Child wrote her best-selling book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. This was 1961. Her PBS show, The French Chef, the first food show on TV, would run from 1963 to 1973, and it was all the rage. Now, data point number 2, growing up in a passionately Francophile household during the 60s and 70s, restaurateur legend Danny Meyer would spend 1984 as a kitchen intern both in France and Italy in preparation for his hospitality career. In 1985, he opened the groundbreaking Union Square Cafe, which had a very eclectic menu, but it advertised itself as American cuisine with an Italian soul. And data point number 3, 25 years later, Esquire magazine food and travel writer John Mariani published a book. This is a great book, I highly recommend it, How Italian Food Conquered the World. And he looks at this both from the standpoint of popular and critical acclaim. Now with food, it took a bit longer than fashion, but Italy would topple France in the culinary realm, just as it had in fashion and design. However, this did not begin auspiciously. In celebration for the unification of Italy in 1861, the king held a state dinner, and it featured a few Italian dishes, but it was principally French, and the menu was written entirely in French. Then, a century later, and an ocean away, when Julia Child was showing TV audiences how to prepare a souffle, those very same viewers could flip channels and hear, uh-oh, spaghettios, right? And come away with the impression that these inexpensive canned goods were what Italian cuisine was about. But then the tables began to turn. And it started with the surge of American tourism to Italy, triggered by the romance and allure of movies like Roman Holiday. And Italy, visitors enjoyed good, honest, affordable fare in local trattoria, delicious food made from fresh ingredients, not Chef Boyardee again, nor was it fancy, fussy French fare, but satisfying food that people could imagine eating every day. Now, the first high-end Italian restaurant in New York featured cuisine from the north, which was more refined than stereotypical red sauce Southern Italian fare, with a bit of French influence. And this really helped to expand the perception of Italian food being more than just spaghetti and meatballs. Now, Tony May, this was his restaurant, Palio. He became a culinary evangelist at the high end and formed an association to foster the understanding of authentic Italian cuisine and to enhance its image through education. Tony famously declared, "We must shift attention from pizza to white truffles, from spaghetti and meatballs to pappardelle à lepre, which is wild hair, from cheap table wines to Brunello di Montalcino." And that was 1980. And at that time, if you recall, risotto had become the rage. The next year, his association helped build the Caterina de' Medici restaurant and teaching program at the Culinary Institute at Hyde Park, which is today the country's premier cooking institution. Now, all of this was contemporaneous with America's growing interest in healthier food, fresh ingredients, the food pyramid, which green-lighted pasta, right, and the Mediterranean diet, which anointed olive oil, as a miracle ingredient, which dealt a body blow to classic French cuisine. And just like Italian ready-to-wear fashion, a steaming plate of hot pasta was just a better fit with more casual lifestyles. Classic French was too formal, too heavy, too serious, too fussy, and then you might remember Nouvelle cuisine, filet of basil leaf. It's just silly, right? And it's interesting because farm-to-table movement, I was like, oh, farm-to-table, it inherently favors local seasonal ingredients, but that's what Italian cuisine has always been. It's always been seasonal, it's always been local. So farm-to-table is not a new idea. It's what authentic Italian cuisine is really all about. And today we see the popularity of cucina povera, peasant cuisine, or the poor cooking tradition of rural Italy, especially the South, and its waste-nothing ethic has inspired great creativity, from bruschetta to prosciutto to pizza. And some of the most ingenious dishes that we love today were invented out of necessity by peasants hundreds of years ago. They simply made the most out of simple ingredients available. Now, pizza is interesting, and we have all of this culinary innovation that's occurred at the lower end of Italian cuisine. And pizza is a great example of cucina povera. So pizza had very humble beginnings. So ovens didn't have thermostats, right? So what they would do is they would take a little flat bread and put it into the oven to kind of get a sense of the temperature of the oven, if it was warm enough and how warm it was. So you would never throw away anything edible. And so these little flatbreads were enhanced with whatever happened to be around, a little tomato, a little cheese, and then later in the hands of creative geniuses like Wolfgang Puck, pizza would acquire new culinary cred. And just as French fashion had painted itself into this upscale, uptight corner, so too had French cuisine. Not only did Italian fare offer something for everyone, it's also virtually impossible to tire of. And on every level, it accomplished something truly amazing, transforming food into a fashion and lifestyle statement. So if Julia Child was World War II, post-World War II culinary evangelist, today it's of course this woman, Lydia Bastianich. Her PBS show has been going strong for close to 25 years. She's run several Emmys, dozens of cookbooks, including Mastering the Art of Italian Cooking, and has been inducted into the Culinary Hall of Fame. So in the realm of food, the world finally caught up or came around to embracing and falling in love with authentic Italian foods. Now, in my final remarks, I know this is a little long, but I can't help leave this without mentioning Italian wines. Because 70 years ago, Italian wines weren't remotely into the ballpark, and there was a tremendous amount of catching up to do. So in my closing remarks, I'm going to highlight what only can be characterized as a total transformation of Italian winemaking. So Italian winemaking goes back thousands of years, beginning with Dionysius, who discovered the first vine in Sicily, and then of course there was Pliny the Elder, the Roman scholar, who famously declared, "In vino veritas," in wine there is truth. But the real truth was that Italy's wines had been terrible for several centuries, despite the country's truly terrific terroir and bountiful variety of indigenous grapes. In 1967, the 760-page New Encyclopedia of Wines and Spirits devoted exactly 4.5 pages to Italian wines. So today, virtually every wine anywhere in Italy, from Sicily to the Alps, is totally different than it was 70 years ago. Now, everything you can imagine has contributed to this, but I just want to highlight two biggies. So the first is Italy had been growing grapes, making wine, and labeling wines in a wildly inconsistent and undisciplined manner. So there was really no way to know what you were getting. You know, it could be labeled Chianti, but who knows what was in the bottle. It could be splendid or it could be swill. And in 1963, the Ministry of Agriculture introduced a classification system that helped remedy the situation by creating a common language and standards, the DOC, the DOCG, which basically established a floor or quality control. But in so doing, they also, you know, by creating these standards, also kind of created a ceiling for how high is up and innovation. But as we all know, rules never have stopped Italians, which leads to our second big game changer, and this was at the high end, which was the development of the Super Tuscans, which use non-Italian grapes, so-called alien grapes, not, you know, regulated by the DOC or DOCG, and growing these grapes and blending these grapes with Italian grapes in Italian soil. So, you know, these were completely outside the parameters of regulation. And these Super Tuscans were pioneered by the Antinori family, whose winemaking history goes back to the Renaissance. And these wines made winemaking history themselves, acing out French counterparts in prestigious competitions. This was quite amazing. And in contrast to Italian food, which just needed to be better understood and appreciated, Italian wines really had to be modernized and reimagined, and they have come such a long way from the Ruffino bottle repurposed with a candlestick. So have Italian wines surpassed French? Well, most experts would agree it's a coin toss. And from last year's list of top 100 bottles of wine from Wine Spectator magazine, 9 of the 25 were Italian labels, including the one in first and third position. France came in second with 5 selections, and that's the honest veritas. So, Italy's third golden age is very much with us today. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Italy needed to rebuild its own borders, and it also needed to rehabilitate its image. Now, Italy has accomplished that, and so much more. Italy's miraculous makeover in these last 7 decades has won the world over in major ways. But what sort of triumph was this? If Rome was a triumph of engineering and organizational genius, and Renaissance Florence was a triumph of creative and imaginative genius, Italy's third golden age was all of those things too, but with one added ingredient, specially tailored to the times. It was, and it is, a triumph of marketing genius. Our sense of Italy today, brand Italy, is a masterwork of marketing and lifestyle marketing. 2,000 years ago, Rome conquered a great swath of territory with its military might. This was not an option for defeated post-war Italy, but times change. But one thing that hasn't changed is that throughout history, Italy has demonstrated this cultural DNA, a passion and a resilience. And Italians just have this innate ability to pivot and to adapt, even in the worst of circumstances. Somehow, Italians always bounce back. Post-World War II, Italy would never again conquer foreign lands by force, as the Romans had, but it would conquer a different and more precious form of territory, that which lies between the ears and the chest cavity, the hearts and minds of the world. And this new conquest would not be one of brute force, but one of the power of attraction. Today's Italy offers an alluring new vision of how to be in the world. Italians just seem to know how to live life, be present, savor the moment, how to eat, how to drink, how to get about. And people the world over yearn to do it just like the Italians. So, mille grazie. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'm happy to take your questions.